2 Kings chapter 4 and verse 1. We find here where the prophet of God is told to go out and travel for a distance. Not only is he told to travel, Not only is he told to travel, but he's told to travel with some faith. And as he's traveling, there's a drought that's happened. There's a famine. He's told to go and hide in a cave. And while he's hiding in this cave, God commands some ravens to bring him some bread and meat. And as he's hiding there, or resting there, waiting for God's command, one day the ravens quit coming. And they quit bringing him some bread and meat. So God says to him to go off and travel some more. He'll tell him where to stay, where to stop. And he keeps on traveling. And he encounters from a distance a widow and her son. And he says to this widow, bring me some water in a jar. The lady says, okay. And he says to her, and when you come back, bring me also some bread. The lady says, I can't bring you bread because I only have enough flour and enough oil for my son and myself, and I'm out getting some oil or some sticks to make some bread and flour for my son and myself. That's 1 Kings chapter 17. I told you wrong. I apologize. 1 Kings chapter 17. Now I'm out getting some flour or some sticks so I can make some bread for my son and myself. We have very little and not enough for you. So the prophet of God says, go and bring me the water and also bring me the bread. Make me bread, and I assure you that if you bring me the bread first, that there will be enough flour and enough oil left for you and your son until God sends rain upon the earth. So the woman went and did as the prophet said. Let's read there in verse 17. Now it came about after these things that the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became sick. And his sickness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. He went and lived and stayed there. And indeed, as he had said, there was enough bread and enough flour and oil, as God had said, or the prophet had said, God had provided. But then also her only son died. And in verse 17, the woman comes to him, in verse 18 rather, and says to him, what do I have to do with you, O man of God? Do you have come to me to bring my iniquity to remembrance and put my son to death? She, for some reason, is blaming the prophet Elijah for her son's death. Now, for whatever reason she is believing, she's thinking that the prophet living inside of her house is the reason that her son is dead. That the iniquity is now brought to her house, and that is the reason that her son has died. So Elijah says to her in verse 19, give me your son. Then he took him from her bosom and carried him up to the upper room where he was staying, because she had prepared a room for him to stay, and laid him on his own bed. And he called to the Lord and said, O my God, O my Lord, have you also brought calamity to the widow with whom I am staying by causing her son to die? Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and called to the Lord and said, O Lord my God, I pray you, let this child's life return to him. And the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child returned to him, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper room into the house and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, see, your son is alive. Then the woman said to Elijah, now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth. Now, a question that I'd like to pose to you is, can Jesus be seen in us? In our everyday lives and everything that we do every single day, can people see Jesus in us? And whatever that you do, whatever your career and your profession might be, whether you have a career or whether you're retired, and your dealings with your wife and with your husband, with your children or grandchildren, with those that you are shopping around with, or those that you encounter at the store or in your career, can people see Jesus in you? Hopefully the world can see him in our lives. The Apostle Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 1, are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, as some, letters of commendation to you or from you? You are our letter, he says, to the Corinthians. You are our letter, written in our hearts, known and read by all men. An epistle written and read among all men. Paul says, people can see us or see you written in us. In Acts chapter 4 and verse 13, here the apostles had been arrested and released. And as they're preaching, look at verse 13, Acts 4 and verse 13. Now as they observed the confidence of Peter and John, and understood that they were uneducated and untrained men, the people were amazed and began to recognize them as having been with Jesus. You know, there are some folks that Sunday morning after church, as soon as they drive off the property, get behind the wheel of their vehicle and drive off the property, that they act like idiots on the road, because of road rage, that it doesn't seem like they spent an hour of worshiping Jesus Christ and singing praises to him. There are folks that leave Sunday morning worship and go to a restaurant and complain and argue and leave 25 cents as a tip out of protest, after having spent an hour with Christians or two, worshiping and praising God and studying about the love of Jesus and the compassion and grace of Jesus, but yet when they go out in public, they act like fools and idiots. Can Jesus be seen in us? You know, something interesting about the story we just read in 1 Kings chapter 17, something interesting in verse 24 has struck me. The widow of Zarephath made a very thoughtful and provoking statement when she said, now by the resurrection of the widow's son, now by this I know that you are a man of God. I guess it wasn't enough that she never ran out of flour and oil. But now by the resurrection of her son, she can say, now by this I know that you're a man of God because you kept your word. It is this statement that I want us to consider this evening. By what do we make known to the world that we are a child of God? By what do we make known to the world that we are children redeemed, saved, purchased, and cleansed by the blood of Christ? Is it by a crucifix that we wear that we have to declare to the people that we're saved? Is it by a John 3:16 tattoo that we have tattooed on our arms? Is it by a fish symbol that we carry around somewhere? Is it by a bumper sticker that says, let's coexist? Is it by an external sign that we inform the world that we are Christians? But you see, the Scriptures never teaches that we need to wear a crucifix or tattoo John 3:16 to our foreheads to let the world know that Jesus lives in us. There has to be a different way. There has to be a better way that Jesus can be seen in us when we're out in the world. In John chapter 13, and verse 34 and 35, John chapter 13, and verse 34 through 35 says, "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. And by this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Now, what's the context here? The context here is when Jesus is predicting that one of the 12 that he's having supper with is going to betray him. The context is when Jesus, after he has supper with these 12 apostles, and has the knowledge that one of these 12 apostles is going to betray him, namely Judas Iscariot, the treasurer, for 30 measly pieces of silver. And then Jesus girds his clothes and gets down on the floor and washes the feet of all the apostles, including Judas. The context is all of this when Jesus then says in John 13 verse 34, "I want you to love one another. I'm giving you a new commandment, that you love one another." And the newness of that commandment is, to the extent that I have loved you, even the one that is called the son of perdition, that I know is going to kill me, I want you to love him and everyone else that will hate you. And by that is how people will know that you are my disciples, my followers. By that is how people will know that you are Christians. By loving one another to the extent that I have loved you. You that will deny me, you that will disappoint me, you that will leave me, you that will fall, you that will doubt me, even you will I love you, and that's how I want you to love one another. Because love identifies the disciple of Christ. Yes, that's how people will know that we are Christian. That's how people will see Jesus in us. 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 9, the Apostle Paul again says, or teaches us, that love was a very fundamental characteristic of the early church. 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 9, "Now as to the love of the brethren, you have no need for anyone to write to you, for you yourselves are taught by God to love one another." And the Thessalonians was a very loving church. For they, in their financial need, they were in need themselves financially. But when they heard that the church who was in Macedonia was in need, they, out of their very desperate need themselves, took money to help the Christians in Macedonia. So people knew that the Christians at Thessalonica were Christians because of the love that they demonstrated towards others. Again, the Apostle Paul, in Galatians 5 and verse 12, when he's talking about the fruit of the Spirit, he says in verse 2, Galatians 5 and verse 2, "Behold, I, Paul, say that if you receive," not that one. That was about circumcision. "That love is one of the fruit of the Spirit. That without love, that fruit of the Spirit is not complete." And I encourage you to read this text carefully, that it does not say the fruits of the Spirit, but the fruit of the Spirit. If one of these characteristics is missing, the fruit itself is not complete. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the great chapter about love, in the first 8 verses, it gives us all the characteristics of what genuine love is all about. And this is a chapter that we generally read as ministers when we marry a couple. And we talk about genuine love and how excellent, about the excellence of love. If I speak with tongues of men and angels, but do not have love, then I've become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Because love has to really mean something. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And then in verse 4, he goes on to say that love is very patient. Love is kind. Love is not jealous. Love does not brag, and it is not arrogant. Love does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own. It is not provoked, and it is not. So it gives us a list of what love is not and what love is. So when we are out and about in public, dealing with our co-workers, dealing with those that are around us, with the general public, or with our mates, or with our children, or our family members, if we're acting impatiently, if we're not kind, if we're jealous or imprudent or we're braggadocious, then Jesus is not in us. We're not letting people see Jesus in us. But another way that Jesus can be seen in us is by what Jesus says in Matthew 5 and verse 16 when he spoke or preached that Sermon on the Mount. When he said, "Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works." Now this seems to be in contrary to other scripture that says, "Don't do your good works to be seen of men." But what Jesus is talking about here is that we ought to behave and live in such a way that we're kind, that we're loving, that we're compassionate and gracious towards everyone. That's what he's talking about. In Ephesians 5 and verses 8 through 15, the idea behind Paul's exhortation here when he talks about being imitators of God is that light is to expose error and illuminate righteousness. Read with me there in verse 8, "For you were formerly in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth, trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord, and do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them." So at one time, before we were Christians, we lived as unprincipled people, people without a bridle, people without principles. But now as Christians, we are to expose the unfruitful works of darkness and walk in the light. Now, I told some of you before that a few weeks ago I read I believe it was an Instagram post from one of my friends from high school. She posted a picture that said, "I like to take hot showers to prepare myself to go to hell." And that just hurt my heart. That I have a friend that my influence was never strong enough to touch her heart, to influence her, to teach her how terrible a place hell is, where she would jokingly put something like that on social media, that she likes to take hot showers to get ready for hell. And I'm sure that there are more people like that would joke about hell that way and will laugh it off with a couple of beers. But there has to be something mentally, psychologically wrong with people who know the spiritual ramifications of going to heaven and going to hell, how could we joke about going to hell like that? My response to her was, when you play with the devil, you best be careful what you ask for. Because the ones that dance with the devil will eventually live with the devil eternally. And our job as Christians is to live in such a way, not at a bar drinking beers and laughing at things like that, but exposing the ignorance and the severity of stupidity of folks that would say things like that and laugh about going to hell. I often weep about my brother going to hell, or my grandmother going to hell. I often weep about some of my great friends whom I tried to influence and try to get them to change their minds and go to heaven, but chose not to, or chose to cling on to their false ideas. But in the end, I understand and I accept that it is a decision that folks make on their own. But that does not relieve the pain and the anguish that those of us who are alive must struggle with. But we need to live in such a way that we influence those that are still alive, so they can see Jesus and the happiness that Jesus does bring in our lives, so they can go to heaven. And one final thought. Jesus can be seen in our lives by our loyalty to Christ. And loyalty can be seen in three ways, or summarized in three ways. Loyalty to God, by bearing the marks of Christ in our bodies. In Galatians chapter 6, in verse 17, from now on, let no one cause trouble for me, Paul said, for I bear on my body the brand marks of Jesus. And I believe that what Paul meant was a literal scars on his body, where he had been beaten and left for dead several times. And basically what Paul is saying is this: don't accuse me of not loving my Lord. Don't accuse me of not being loyal to Jesus. Because on my body, in Galatians 6 and 17, you can see all the scars for Christ. And if we could see the scars on Paul's souls, there'd be no doubt there's loyalty. In Galatians 6 and verse 2, there's another category where our loyalty can be summarized, and that's loyalty to others. That's bearing one another's burdens. Galatians 6 and verse 2. Bear one another's burdens and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. You know, when Jesus said, I give you another commandment, to love one another even as I have loved you, and by this people can see Christ in you. Then he says, now bear one another's burdens and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. Someone wrote a letter of recommendation for me once. It wasn't the first one. I've had several letters that I've needed for different things for recommendation. But I have never had anyone write this in a letter. And it said, Ed is extremely loyal to me. And that just made me feel good. That someone would think that I, to that person, was extremely loyal. But here the Apostle Paul is saying that by me bearing your burdens and you bearing my burdens is a way in how I can show my loyalty and you can show your loyalty to me and I to you. And this is one way that Jesus can be seen in us. And then Galatians chapter 6 and verse 5, another way that loyalty can be summarized is by showing loyalty to ourselves. Because just as we have a responsibility to be loyal to God and loyal to others, in Galatians 6:5 says, for each one will bear his own load. That means that I need to take care of my own business when I can. Then I need to carry my own load when I can. That I don't need to be a burden, a needless burden on others. That I don't need a mooch of other people when I don't have to. I said my final thought, but I don't want to say I lied, but I was wrong. There's one final one here. This one is the final one. There was a lady that got onto her husband during a meeting when there was wooden pews in church buildings. He had taken out his knife and was cutting notches on the back of the pew. He had about 12 notches. And she leaned over and she said to her husband, what are you doing? He said, every time that lying preacher says in conclusion, I've notched it. But this was the last one, really. One final way that I want to share with you that Jesus can be seen in us is by our burning, longing desire to go to heaven. I've known several people, but mostly they were women, Christian women. In their 80s and 90s, they would say, Brother Ed, I don't care what happens. I don't care about politics. I don't care about houses or cars or how much money I have in the bank account, whether I have any or not. I don't care about shoes or clothes. I don't even care about my health. I just care about going to heaven. A burning desire. If people could see in us every single day that I wake up for Jesus, that I live to go to heaven when it is time, that my only desire is to please Him. My only desire is to be with Him, to do His will so that I can be with Him. Then that will show my happiness. That will show my just over sense, my jubilant desire. You could ask people where I work, where I bank, where I frequent. Ask them, what's Ed? What do you think about Ed's attitude. And most of them will tell you, when we ask Ed how he's doing, he'll tell you, I'm doing wonderfully well, and it gets better. Whether I hurt, whether I'm sick, or whether I have problems, my response is always the same. I am doing wonderfully well, and it gets better. And you know why? Because one day, I'm going to heaven. Aren't you? And if people could see that in us, every single day, they want to know what kind of drugs you're on. They want to know what's wrong with you. And they're going to ask you, well, how is that possible that you're doing wonderfully well and it gets better? Well, I tell them, my Lord said in Matthew 6 and verse 19, that my treasure is not on this earth. My treasure is in heaven. And where my treasure is, said Jesus, that's where I'm going. I got to cash it in one day. And I don't have much to cash in on this earth. I got to cash it in heaven. And just like Father Abraham in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8, that when he was called by faith, he obeyed by going out to a place where he was to receive an inheritance. And by faith I've been called. Whether I'm sick or not, whether I hurt or not, by faith I've been called to a mansion that Jesus said he would prepare for me. And when he said he'd go, he meant by that he's coming back. And he's coming back for me. And just like Paul desired in Philippians 1 verse 21, he desired to be with Christ. For to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. And buddy, I've got a lot to gain in heaven and not much to gain on this earth. And this is why I'm doing wonderfully well, and it gets better every single minute that I live. If we could have these attitudes by our love, by our light, by our loyalty, and by our longing to go to heaven, wouldn't it be wonderful if folks started asking us, what's wrong with you? Are you mentally ill? And we could say to them, no, I'm just saved. How about you? And then they say to you, yes, I'm saved too, but I don't feel like you. Then something's wrong with your salvation. Let's talk about that. I pray, my friends and my brethren, that I've said something to stir you up. And think about these things, and together we stand and sing.